Hello everyone, and welcome back to History 1152. In this video, we will discuss the 1970s. The 1970s is often viewed as a difficult and chaotic time in American history, and in many ways it was. It saw the continuation of the immensely unpopular Vietnam War and the large, often acrimonious protests against the U.S. involvement in this conflict. It also saw the Watergate incident, perhaps the largest political scandal in American history. In addition, the counterculture movement continued and became more mainstream in society, sparking a backlash amongst American conservatives from a variety of backgrounds. The nation also faced a crippling economic recession on the backdrop of a changing economy and a continuing Cold War. Upon looking at the 1970s, it can be easy to see the decade as a depressing and hopeless period in American history, especially when comparing it with the gains the civil rights movement made in the 1960s and the economic prosperity that the nation enjoyed in the 1950s and then later in the 1980s. There were, however, some important and enduring, if controversial, things that happened in the 1970s that are still in effect today. Let's go back to the beginning, 1970. In 1970, the Vietnam War loomed large as a concern in American public life and consciousness. President Nixon, who had won the 1968 election partially on the promise of winning the Vietnam War, struggled with his pledge. The U.S. military had removed most of its ground troops, keeping its elite advisors deployed to help the faltering South Vietnamese Army, ARVN. Nixon continued the removal of ground soldiers and ordered the withdrawal of American support troops as well, leading the number of American casualties to go down by at least half. At the same time, however, the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam conflict intensified on other fronts. The Nixon administration authorized strategic bombing campaigns. These bombing campaigns targeted locations in Laos and Cambodia, especially the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of roads and tunnels that cut through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia to keep the Viet Cong insurgency and the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, supplied during its operations in the south. These bombings would ultimately culminate with the Operation Linebacker and Linebacker II campaigns, in response to increased incursions by the NVA. The strategic bombings weakened the North Vietnamese military by destroying North Vietnamese industrial production and making logistics more challenging, although they remained very controversial in the U.S. The bombings, along with a break in friendly relations between China and the USSR, the Sino-Soviet split, helped to encourage Vietnam to attend the Paris Peace Accords and to force North Vietnam to accept a peace agreement, at least temporarily. On the home front, though, protesters continued to criticize the U.S. military's involvement in the Vietnam War. Protesters were angry about the draft and about the high number of American and Vietnamese casualties. But the demonstrators began to more broadly condemn the American military and government for the destruction it had visited upon the Vietnamese people during the war. The Vietnam War was a brutal conflict in which both sides committed violence against civilians, as seen during the Tet Offensive by the NVA and during the U.S. counterinsurgency, as demonstrated by the My Lai massacre. While many Vietnam veterans opposed the war and even campaigned against it, more radical protesters adopted anti-military rhetoric, referring to soldiers as baby killers. Many American servicemen tried to hide the fact that they were in the military to avoid being harassed in public as well. Kent State shootings on May 4, 1970, saw Ohio National Guard soldiers fire on student protesters at Kent State University here in the Buckeye State. The students were protesting the Vietnam War, but also the Cambodian incursion by the U.S. military, as well as the continued presence of the National Guard on the university campus. The protests started out peacefully, but became more violent as several buildings, including the Kent State ROTC Center, were destroyed. Some of the property damage may have been done by people who had no affiliation with the student protesters. On Monday, May 4th, 1970, about 2,000 students gathered on the campus to protest at the University Commons. Guardsmen arrived on the scene with orders to disperse the protesters, as university administration had ordered protests be canceled. The guardsmen launched tear gas grenades at the students, and the students shouted epithets at the guardsmen, calling them pigs, a derogatory term for law enforcement. The students also threw rocks and fired tear gas canisters that the soldiers had launched at them back at the soldiers. At approximately 12:24 p.m., the soldiers fired on the protesters. About 30 guardsmen fired over 60 rounds of ammunition over the course of about 13 seconds. In the shooting, 4 students were killed and 9 were wounded. All of the protesters that were shot were students of the university. In the wake of the killings, what some referred to as a massacre, the university condemned the conduct of the guardsmen, but also the student protesters. The Nixon administration condemned the killings, although Nixon himself appeared ambivalent. 5 of the guardsmen were indicted on felony charges, and more were brought up on misdemeanors, but the guardsmen argued that they had acted in self-defense. The prosecution and critics of the guardsmen claimed that the protesters were too far away to have put the guardsmen's lives in danger, but the justice system ultimately decided not to find them guilty. The Kent State shooting would inspire a massive national protest in which college students, up to 4 million, may have protested against the Vietnam War and the U.S. government. Even though the American public had come to oppose the war, they generally supported the guardsmen and the Nixon administration's handling of the case. The killings would also change how the National Guard and other civilian law enforcement organizations handled protests and riots. Specifically, the killings would lead to the issue of less lethal arms and materiel like rubber bullets and riot shields. The Kent State shooting and the protests that came in its wake revealed the discontent that many young people had with the Nixon administration and the state of U.S. politics and culture as a whole. Young people's protests helped to inspire the passage of the 26th Amendment to the Constitution on July 1, 1971. The 26th Amendment declared that states could not bar anyone who was 18 or older from voting, who was also a citizen. The move to lower the voting age to 18, down from 21, had been ongoing since the 1940s, but the draft of young men who could not vote and the student protests both before and after Kent State inspired the passage of the 26th Amendment, which passed quickly and with bipartisan support. Scholars have since added the 26th Amendment to other laws in the United States that have extended the franchise. They grouped the 26th Amendment alongside the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote, the 19th Amendment, which extended the franchise to women, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protected African Americans' voting rights. In 1972, President Richard Nixon ran for re-election. Nixon ran against George McGovern, a Democratic senator from South Dakota. McGovern identified himself as a member of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and promised that if he were elected president, he would end the Vietnam War immediately, regardless of what the outcome would mean for the United States. McGovern, like Nixon, had served in the Second World War, and McGovern had also earned a PhD, working as a history professor before getting into politics. Many progressives and academics supported McGovern, as he was a strong supporter of progressive legislation, like the extension of welfare programs and the war on poverty. McGovern faced many challenges in the Democratic Party, especially from Southern Democrats, who believed that he would continue to push for integration for African Americans. Labor organizations, notably the AFL-CIO, which generally supported Democrats, refused to endorse McGovern. While many progressives, academics, and left-wing people supported McGovern, many everyday Americans, especially those in the white working class who typically voted Democrat, did not vote for McGovern. Instead, they voted for the anti-integrationist candidate George Wallace in the primaries, but many more voted for Richard Nixon in the general election, who promised peace with honor in Vietnam, an end to the protests across the nation, and had criticized integrationist policies like busing. Wallace had dropped out of the race after he was severely wounded in an assassination attempt as well. Nixon consistently led McGovern in the polls leading up to the election, and he outspent McGovern by about 2-1. In the end, Nixon won, unsurprisingly. What was more surprising was that Nixon won in a landslide, gaining over 60% of the popular vote in all states except for Massachusetts. McGovern only won the Bay State and the District of Columbia. He even lost his own state of South Dakota. Nixon had commandingly won the 1972 election, even getting a large portion of the youth vote, but the seeds of his destruction had been sown during the campaign. Nixon worried that McGovern was a serious threat to his re-election, and he had ordered his dirty trick squad to dig up dirt on McGovern, even if doing this meant resorting to illegal activity. On June 17, 1972, 5 months before the election, 5 men broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. The men broke into the DNC office looking for files and incriminating evidence. Later that night, the police arrested the 5 men and found evidence linking them to the Republican Party. Nixon probably did not order the break-in or burglary, but he had commanded his operatives to wiretap the telephones of the DNC, find dirt on his political opponents through the Dirty Tricks Squad, and use dubious tactics to stop information leaks using the White House plumbers. Nixon had also recorded many of his conversations that he had in the White House. Washington Post journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein reported, based on information they had received from anonymous sources, that the Watergate break-in was just the tip of the iceberg of political corruption and intimidation that was going on in the Nixon administration. Evidence continued to mount against Nixon that he had been involved in the corruption and other illegal or at least unethical activities, including the cover-up of the Watergate break-in. The House Judiciary Committee put forth articles of impeachment against Nixon. In response to this, Nixon chose to resign on August 9, 1974, the only president to do so. He probably would have been impeached by the House of Representatives and convicted in the Senate if he had remained in the presidency. In Nixon's place, his vice president, Gerald Ford, became president, leading the remainder of Nixon's term, and then pardoned Nixon. The Watergate scandal was a significant moment in American political and cultural history. Political scandals and corruption were not new things in the 1970s, and the nation had been engulfed in many indignities since Watergate as well. Watergate, however, became a massive issue for the American public due to the incredible social unrest the country was experiencing due to the Vietnam War, and the lack of trust the people had for the U.S. government ever since the assassination of JFK back in 1963. In retrospect, Nixon's presidency and indeed his entire legacy, has been overshadowed by the Watergate scandal. A lot of people don't know much about his policies, or they only know about his most controversial ones, such as his order to bomb North Vietnamese urban industrial centers during the linebacker operations, his role in the war on drugs, or his attempts to build a coalition amongst conservative whites, some of whom opposed racial integration. Many write off Nixon, identifying as a conservative, even a reactionary, during a time of social change. We often forget, though, that Nixon actually advocated for some important progressive policies, many of which are still in effect today. Nixon enacted wage and price controls in order to combat inflation, and he helped to end the dollar's convertibility to silver, a policy that had been supported by the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Nixon had also helped to found the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, addressing the growing environmentalist movement. Nixon also oversaw the passing of legislation to protect worker safety, make employers offer insurance to their employees, and the expansion of Medicaid. When it came to race relations, Nixon, across his political career, toned down his pro-civil rights stances over time, hoping to appeal to Southern whites who were beginning to reject the Democratic Party in increasing numbers. Nixon tried to offer a middle way that went between the progressive policies of the liberal Democrats and the reactionary stances of the anti-integrationists like George Wallace. Nixon did not reverse desegregation, but probably slowed it down. Nixon opposed busing, but ultimately enforced it in the North. Nixon was also accused of using quote-unquote dog whistle tactics, coded language that would have different meanings to different groups of people. For example, critics of Nixon have argued that his promise of law and order would mean the suppressing of protests to the average American voter, but to a Southern Democrat, law and order might sound like a tacit endorsement of the fight against laws that forbade racial segregation. The use of the term dog whistle and its identification with Nixon remains controversial to this day. We should also remember that Nixon supported affirmative action, which helped African Americans and other minorities have an easier time pursuing education and employment. Nixon also voiced support for a version of the Equal Rights Act, which promised to eliminate delineations that federal law had made between men and women. Although this act has remained controversial amongst feminist and women's issues activists to this day. In the end, Nixon was a very complex political figure who did not truly fit the liberal or conservative molds, and most of his policies, good or bad, have been overshadowed by Watergate. The Nixon administration had a profound effect on American domestic policy, leaving a contested legacy, but Nixon and his cabinet's foreign policy would also impact American foreign relations. Nixon had promised to end the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War on acceptable terms. Following the Paris Peace Accords, ratified in January of 1973, Nixon's National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, and the North Vietnamese Politburo leaders brought an end to U.S. involvement in combat in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, removing all troops from the region. The deal was intended to bring an end to the war between the North and the South Vietnamese, but fighting continued, with both sides violating the agreement. The deal also entailed the return of American POWs, many of whom had been abused during their captivity. In the end, over 58,000 American military personnel were killed in the Vietnam War, over a course of nearly 20 years. The conflict had also cost the U.S. over $800 billion in today's money, making it the fourth most expensive war the U.S. has fought. Although the war had been violent and costly, Nixon also promised the South Vietnamese government that the U.S. would offer air support in the event of a large-scale invasion of South Vietnam by the NVA. Nixon resigned from the presidency in 1974, and his successor, Gerald Ford, did not keep this promise. Consequently, the North Vietnamese Army, renamed the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, continued to push southward, taking control of most of South Vietnam by 1975. Saigon would eventually fall on April 30th. In the days leading up to Saigon's capture, the U.S. military worked to evacuate its embassy in the city, along with many South Vietnamese people who had worked with the U.S. After the fall of Saigon, renamed Ho Chi Minh City, South Vietnam's absorption into the Socialist Republic of Vietnam led thousands of South Vietnamese refugees to leave the country. Some went to surrounding nations in Southeast Asia, and others tried to reach America, where many encountered racial discrimination in spite of being former allies with the U.S. In the wake of the fall of South Vietnam, Cambodia would become a communist country, with the Khmer Rouge taking control of the Cambodian government. The Vietnamese and Khmer Rouge government would persecute political dissidents. The persecution of dissidents and ethnic minorities in Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge period under their leader Pol Pot would be considered a genocide, in which up to 2 million people, about a quarter of the Cambodian population, were killed or died from abuse. The debacle in Vietnam had weakened the U.S. presence and reputation in Southeast Asia, and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East would be contentious as well. The Middle East, with its large oil fields in close proximity to the Soviet Union, seemed ripe for expansion for the USSR. Additionally, the establishment of the Jewish nation-state of Israel in Palestine in 1948 and the U.S.'s decision to recognize this country angered many Arab states, who had been intermittently fighting with Israel since the 1940s. Palestinians created groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, founded in 1964, and orchestrated attacks within Israel and against Jewish people around the world, including the murder of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics, in which the PLO partnered with the terrorist organization Black September. The Israeli government responded forcefully to these attacks, striking PLO allied targets outside of Israel, and continued to fight against the Arab states, gaining territory in the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, the Sinai Peninsula, and the West Bank. Egypt attacked Israel during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, hoping to retake Sinai, which had previously belonged to Egypt. Israel pushed Egypt back after receiving supplies from the U.S. Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, was Jewish and a strong supporter of Israel, although he supported the Jewish state for diplomatic rather than religious reasons. Kissinger saw Israel as an important Western ally in the Middle East, especially as the Soviet Union made alliance overtures to the Arab states. But the U.S.'s support for Israel would damage its relationship with the oil-producing Arab states, leading to an oil embargo against the U.S. and its allies, the effects of which would be felt for the rest of the 1970s. Further to the east, the U.S. looked to prevent the expansion of Soviet power in Central Asia. The U.S. and Great Britain had supported a coup in Persia, or Iran as it is more commonly known. America and the British supported the removal of Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh in 1953, after his government had nationalized the Iranian oil industry. There were also concerns that Islamic fundamentalists or communists were in the process of taking over the country, and the coup was designed to stop this. Consequently, the British and the Americans led their coup against Mosaddegh and transformed the ceremonial Iranian Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, into an autocrat. The Shah ruled Iran with an iron fist and made the Iranian state more authoritarian, even as he promised to secularize the country. Initially, many welcomed the Shah's rule, but over time, the Iranian people turned against the Sultan. In 1973, as a result of increased oil prices because of the oil embargo against the US and its allies, Iran became flooded with foreign currency. While the crisis should have benefited Iran's oil-driven economy, it instead caused massive inflation of the Iranian currency, causing a depression. On the back of these privations, the Iranian Islamic Revolution began in 1978. The Shah and his family fled the country, and a cleric, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, returned to take part in the revolution. Khomeini led a popular referendum that turned Iran into an Islamic republic, and another vote to make Iran a theocracy as well. The collapse of the Shah's regime and the transformation of Iran into an Islamic state would only complicate U.S. foreign policy interests in the Middle East and Central Asia. But we'll talk more about these complications later. While the U.S. government had supported a coup against Iran and backed Israel in the Middle East, the U.S. also continued its policy of intervening in Latin American countries as well. The good neighbor policy of the 1930s had mandated the U.S. not interfere in the affairs of its southern neighbors, but in the Cold War climate, domino theory had been applied to Latin America, just as it had been used in Southeast Asia, and U.S. policymakers believed that communism would spread across Latin America if it were not confronted. America had failed to defeat communist Cuba during the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and Cuba had attempted to spread communism to other Latin American countries as well. U.S. Latin American policy during the Cold War in many ways harkened back to the Roosevelt corollary of the early 20th century. It declared that the U.S. had a right, even a mandate, to lead and intervene in Latin American nations. South America in particular had become a hotbed of unrest, as several governments fell to military coups in the 1960s. Chile began to move to the political left, and its democratically elected president, Salvador Allende, promised to transform Chile into a socialist state, and he reached out to Castro. Allende's policies led to a recession in the country, and strikes became common as people turned against the president. On this backdrop, the Chilean military began a coup, and with the assistance of Brazil and the United States, took control of the country by 1973. Allende committed suicide, and General Augusto Pinochet took control of the country. Pinochet ruled as a dictator and suppressed socialist dissidents in his country. He also fostered close relationships with the U.S. as well. While the U.S. had worked to keep Chile from becoming communist, it had also helped destroy a democratic government, replacing it with an authoritarian dictatorship. Pinochet did hold a plebiscite in 1980 in which he was elected president, and Chile did see economic growth in the early 1980s as the nation became more open and adopted free market economic principles. Pinochet failed to win re-election in 1989 and peacefully stepped down from power in 1990, bringing an end to the military dictatorship of the country. Despite this, however, the U.S. support of Pinochet would set a precedent for continuing interventions in Latin America, often to support authoritarian regimes that would be friendly with America and hostile to communism. Now that we've talked about U.S. foreign policy in the 1970s, let's return to domestic politics and life. Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency in 1974, leaving his VP, Gerald Ford, to continue his term. After finishing Nixon's term, Ford ran for president in 1976. Ford ran on his political experience and tried to cast himself as an urbane, principled politician who would not stoop to the lows of his predecessor, Nixon. Ford also took the more passive Rose Garden strategy to campaigning. The problem was that American voters identified Ford with Nixon, along with the failure in Vietnam and the ongoing oil crisis and economic recession. Ford was running against Jimmy Carter, the Democratic governor of Georgia. Carter was able to define himself as different things to different people and build an extensive coalition. Politically, Carter was generally a moderate, walking the line between liberal and conservative wings of the Southern Democratic Party. He was able to appeal to both interests in the party. Carter was a white Southerner, appealing to conservative white Southern Democrats, but he was also able to appeal to liberal Democrats and African American voters as well, through his VP pick, Walter Mondale, who had supported civil rights. Carter was also a strong Christian, which appealed to the emerging evangelical voting bloc. The biggest advantage Carter had, though, was that he was a relatively unknown politician, a so-called peanut farmer from Georgia, and could sell his lack of name recognition as proof that he was a political outsider and above the perceived corruption of national politics. Carter won resoundingly, taking 297 electoral votes and over 50.1% of the popular vote, to Ford's 240 electoral votes and 48% of the popular vote. Carter won all of the southern states, except Virginia, testifying to how he had been able to build a coalition of disparate, often hostile voting blocs, blue-collar whites, Southern conservatives, and African Americans. Once elected president, Carter worked to mitigate the problems that the nation was facing as a result of inflation, the oil crisis, and economic stagnation. Carter created the Department of Energy, which would work to conserve scarce fuel resources. He also helped to pass additional environmental legislation and had solar panels placed on the roof of the White House. On the economic front, Carter witnessed increased inflation and slow economic recovery after the economic recession of the early 1970s. American workers found their wages were not going up in proportion with inflation due to slow economic growth, stagflation. While Carter pushed for increased regulation in some industries, he called for decreased regulation in others. For example, Carter deregulated the airline industry, which ultimately led to air travel being cheaper and more common for everyday Americans. Carter also deregulated the sale of brewing equipment and ingredients, allowing Americans to brew their own beer, jump-starting the craft brewing industry we know today. On the controversial issue of abortion, Carter chose to uphold Roe v. Wade, a Supreme Court decision that legalized the termination of pregnancies, even though most evangelical Christians opposed abortion. Carter himself personally did not agree with abortion, but did not think that he should undermine the Supreme Court's decision and instead believed that he should support programs that would fight poverty and thus prevent abortions. Taken on the whole, Carter's domestic policies tended to lean towards the left by the standards of the day. On the issue of foreign policy, Carter continued the strategy of détente against the Soviet Union and tried to reverse the more aggressive elements of American foreign policy, with the hope of providing calm to international affairs. He tried to arrange deals between the Soviet Union and the US to bring nuclear testing to an end and slow the nuclear arms race between the two countries, which had become very costly. He also pushed for reductions of nuclear weapons as well, as seen during the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT II. Carter did take a hard line against the Soviet Union as well at times, especially during their invasion and takeover of Afghanistan in 1978. The Carter administration called for sanctions and embargoes against the USSR and began to supply arms to Afghan insurgents, the Mujahideen. Carter also gave control of the Panama Canal to Panama. Many liberals tend to support Carter's foreign policy, believing he made the U.S. more open, leading the nation's enemies to become more receptive as well. Conservatives, however, tend to argue that Carter made the U.S. weaker on the world stage, and Carter's magnanimity encouraged the aggression on the part of the Soviet Union, especially when it came to the USSR's takeover of Afghanistan. The element of Carter's foreign policy that draws the most criticism is its handling of the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis that ensued. On November 4, 1979, during the revolution, student revolutionaries attacked and took control of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They captured 52 U.S. citizens and held them hostage for more than a year. During the crisis, Carter made fewer public appearances and struggled to gain control of the situation. He authorized economic sanctions against Iran in April of 1980, as well as a U.S. military operation to rescue the hostages, but this operation failed, and the hostages languished in Iranian confinement. Critics of Carter, especially the Republican Ronald Reagan, argued that Carter was doing too little to free the hostages. Reagan made the release of the hostages one of his most important campaign promises. Scholars who have studied Carter's presidency have argued that while Carter was a very principled man who fought for the issues he cared about, he was not a good politician. He micromanaged the activities of his cabinet members and refused to make deals with his domestic rivals, even as he reached out to America's foreign adversaries. He also argued and mistreated his supporters in the Democratic Party, alienating him from the people who had helped him get elected. On the domestic front, Carter came off as weak and unable to fix the economic problems that the country was facing. He asked Americans to sacrifice and put up with the challenges that came with inflation, fuel shortages, and economic stagnation, giving many Americans the feeling that Carter was reneging on his campaign promises. Carter's speeches were often misunderstood or received poorly as well. In his most infamous speech of July 15, 1979, Carter described the crisis of confidence many Americans were feeling and talked about a malaise that had engulfed the country. But he offered few solutions for how to fix the problems that the country was facing. The speech was poorly received by many Americans, who got the impression that the president didn't care enough about their problems to help them. Carter's failures to improve the economy, combined with his handling of the Iranian hostage crisis, caused everyday Americans to lose their confidence in Carter, leading them to support Ronald Reagan in 1980. While many Americans disliked Carter's speech, he had perfectly captured the mood of everyday American life in the 1970s. Americans of all races and backgrounds were becoming pessimistic about the future. Many African Americans felt that their community's activism was faltering, and that American society as a whole had abandoned them, leading some to embrace Black power. White Americans, from all political perspectives, also struggled to deal with the changing of American society. Supporters of counterculture and progressivism thought that the U.S. had not done enough to change its political and social structures, alienating many liberals from mainstream political parties. Americans also observed urban decay as jobs dried up and factories moved offshore, leaving behind blighted urban areas. Americans of all races fled the cities, as urban poverty and crime rates dramatically increased, disproportionate with population growth. As blacks and other minorities migrated to the suburbs, many whites began moving further away from the cities, into exurbs or bedroom communities, in a process called white flight. The emigration of whites from urban centers and urban adjacent suburbs led to a loss of tax revenue and business in these areas, only increasing the trend of urban decay and deindustrialization. White working class people and lower middle class white people, who had typically supported the Democratic Party in its New Deal policies, felt that their party no longer cared about them, and that it was abandoning them in favor of courting minorities and left-leaning wealthy whites, so-called limousine liberals. Their feeling was the Democrats are becoming the party of ivory tower intellectuals and radicals. They also thought that the party cared more about poor minorities than it did about poor whites. Whether or not these sentiments were true, they would grow over time amongst white blue-collar workers, leading many to defect to Nixon and the Republican Party in 1972, since he promised stability, law and order, and economic growth. Carter would manage to win back much of their support in 1976, but Carter's failures and Ronald Reagan's campaign promises would lead many to vote Republican in 1980. The South was also moving on a more Republican trajectory as well, thanks in part to Richard Nixon's Southern strategy. While some working-class white people changed their allegiance for racist reasons, many others did so because they felt that the Democratic Party was radicalizing and weakening the country with its liberal policies, which they thought went too far beyond the New Deal programs of previous decades. The New Deal coalition between working-class whites, white liberals, and African Americans was beginning to unravel and would continue to fall apart into the 21st century. How did the large-scale dissatisfaction that Americans felt in the 1970s manifest in daily life? Many everyday Americans turned to elements of the countercultural movement, especially drug use, although this outlet of escape would become more difficult thanks to the war on drugs, especially the criminalization of marijuana. Many Americans turned to religion as well. Church attendance had declined in the 1960s and would continue to fall for the rest of the 1970s, although at a slightly slower rate than the 60s, suggesting that more Americans were looking to Christianity in a time of difficulty. Other faiths, especially Far Eastern and non-Western religions, gained popularity in the U.S. during this time, and indeed across the Western world. The counterculture movement remained powerful in the 1970s, and it continued to question all aspects of Western society, especially organized Christianity. Even as religiosity declined as a whole, Orthodox American Christians, who tended to be more conservative politically, began to galvanize and unite as never before. Protestant Christians had traditionally been hostile to Catholics, even as late as the 1960s during the election of the Catholic John F. Kennedy. In a time of great change, American conservative Protestants and Catholics decided that they needed to become allies, particularly to fight against abortion, which most Christians regarded as immoral for a variety of reasons, leading to the creation of the pro-life movement. They were opposed by liberals and feminists who believed that abortion could prevent poverty, and that abortion was the next step in women's liberation and the sexual revolution, the pro-choice movement. African American Christians were more divided over abortion. Evangelical Christians, for whom abortion was an important issue, would become the backbone of the growing American conservative movement, which had been growing since the 1960s, with the presidential candidacy of Barry Goldwater and the writings of William F. Buckley, Jr. The conservative movement would mix elements of traditionalism, Christian religiosity, classical liberalism, and free market economics, prompting the Republican Party's rightward shift in the 1970s, culminating with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. The women's liberation and feminist movements grew during the 1970s as well. Inspired by the successes of the civil rights movement, a generation of feminists, second-wave feminists, fought to ensure that women received equal pay for equal work, equal access to funds and facilities for female college students, and increased reproductive rights, especially when it came to contraception and abortion. The second wave of feminism contained a liberal wing, which fought for equality between men and women, and a radical wing, which was more focused on protesting social norms that oppressed women, what it called the patriarchy. While many women supported the second wave feminist movement, most men, as well as some women, also criticized it. Conservative women argued that the movement was a threat to traditional womanhood, and many working class women felt that the movement was too academic and concerned with the interests of elite, college-attending women. African American women, like Angela Davis, condemned the movement as well for not doing enough to reach out to African American activists. LGBT people also criticized the second wave of feminists, believing that the movement focused too much on the concerns of heterosexual women. LGBT people had been fighting for civil rights for years, and their organized activism, which began in force during the Stonewall riots in 1969, would gain increased visibility in the 1970s. Ultimately, the feminist movement was very controversial in the 1970s, and it remains contentious today, even though the movement has changed greatly since then. During the 1970s, American culture reflected the division in society as a whole. Clothing styles became more individualistic, as American consumers began to try new styles, reflecting their personal tastes. Fashion choices also began to be less of an indicator of a person's political and social views, as they had been in the 1960s and earlier. Conservative males became more likely to grow beards, wear their hair long, and dress casually. Women's styles also became more varied and less conformist as the decades went on. In the early 1970s, both men and women favored styles inspired by the hippies and the embrace of Eastern religions. Bright-colored, patterned, synthetic fabrics became cheaper and more available in the 1970s, leading to the growth of the feminizing glam style for men. Women also liked the glam party style with its bright colors, mini skirts, and jumpsuits. By the mid-1970s, the tight on the top, loose on the bottom would become more common. Young women and men, as part of this look, wore tight blouses and skirts, and also shirts, and loose bell-bottom pants that flared at the ankle. Athletic wear also became more common for everyday use. It was no longer relegated to just being worn during exercise and sports. Fashion as a whole was becoming more casual, including business wear as well. Businessmen began wearing casual leisure suits. Initially patterned off of military fatigues and safari jackets, leisure suits were designed to be worn to both the office and the discotheque after work. Hats also became less of a customary head covering and more of an optional fashion statement as well. African American fashion also changed as well in the 1970s. African Americans had a long history of expressing themselves through their sartorial choices, and they would continue to do so in the 1970s. During the 60s, African Americans, especially civil rights activists, had dressed formally, to appear clean-cut and professional, and worthy of equality to whites. The influence of Black Power, counterculture, and international African liberation movements, however, led many Black people to adopt new styles in the 70s. Black people dressed more informally, or wore leather jackets and berets to imitate radical insurgent groups like the Black Panthers. Black people also began to incorporate African clothing items and fabric patterns into their everyday wear. African folk costume, especially the dashiki, became popular with both black men and women. African Americans also began the Black is Beautiful movement, which encouraged black people to break away from what they saw as Western, white beauty standards, especially when it came to hair, leading many black people to adopt the natural Afro style. American media, especially television and film, were a reflection of 1970s culture. Television entertainment expanded in the 1970s, and TV stations crafted shows to cater to specific demographics. All in the Family, a CBS show starring Carol O'Connor, was meant to appeal to liberal viewers, with its main character, Archie Bunker, being an unflattering portrayal of the older, often racially bigoted conservatives who frequently clashed with their more progressive baby boomer children. Americans from all backgrounds liked the show, even conservative viewers, who laughed at O'Connor's farcical portrayal of them. The show provided a great deal of social commentary as well. It also inspired other television shows, like Maude, which addressed women's issues, and Good Times and the Jeffersons, and Sanford and Sons, which had African American casts. Other shows, like Happy Days and MASH, were set during the 1950s and offered a nostalgic take on the Korean War and 1950s life more broadly. 1950s and early 1960s nostalgia were very strong in the 1970s, especially with white Americans, leading to the popularity of films like Grease and Animal House in 1978. Grease starred the popular movie star John Travolta, who had gained both critical acclaim as an actor and a dancer in the film Saturday Night Fever, in which he played a disgruntled American worker who would escape to the club at night so that he could dance to disco music. Music in the 1970s also changed as well. Rock remained popular, but it was joined by new styles, namely disco and hip-hop. Disco grew out of the European nightclub culture and expanded quickly in the United States, thanks to the sexual revolution and the drug scene popularized by the countercultural movement. Disco dancers expressed their individuality, but also their sexual liberation on the dance floor. Disco would fall out of favor by 1979, as rock made a comeback, and music fans celebrated Disco Demolition Night on July 12, 1979, burning disco records on the field of Comiskey Park in Chicago. Hip-hop music also grew out of the black and Latino music scenes of the Bronx in New York City, and incorporated elements of blues, jazz, Motown, and rock music to create new styles that reflected the diversity, but also the angst of the decade. Hip-hop in the 1970s would give rise to rappers, formerly MCs, as well as DJs becoming mainstream professional music artists. Ultimately, the 1970s was a difficult and chaotic time for Americans from a variety of backgrounds. The decade began with a bloody and demoralizing war and an embarrassing political scandal, and ended with an energy crisis, economic recession, and American citizens being held captive by a hostile nation. Conservatives and liberals alike were dissatisfied with the decade, and most Americans simply wanted something different.